After single-handedly being kept out of the playoffs by Texas Tech, BYU has made some additions this offseason, as well as returning a lot of their young talent in order to make a push at a Big 12 title in 2026. They're returning their starting quarterback in Bear Bachmeier, starting running back in LJ Martin, and their number one wide receiver in Parker Kingston. So overall, the skill position players are there on offense, which is part of the reason that they were able to exceed our prediction last year of 9-3, actually going 12-2 overall, with, like I said, those two losses both being to Texas Tech. One in the regular season, one in the Big 12 championship. But overall, with the offseason they've had and the returning production they've had, I think BYU is looking to have a very solid 2026 season.
And as Jonah was mentioning, they bring back six starters on offense and six starters on defense. And he named off most of those key players that are returning. Defensively, it is mostly coming in the secondary and a couple of linebackers, but the defensive line is the big issue for that defense in terms of loss production. And then offensively, it's a couple offensive linemen, maybe a wide receiver or two. But overall, returning six starters on the offensive and defensive side of the ball is a very good start for this BYU team, especially considering how young most of those starters were, even though they still have a bunch of experienced players on their team, such as that starting running back in LJ Martin. Recruiting wise, high school recruitment class comes in at number 21, and the transfer portal class comes in at number 42. I'm not entirely surprised, and I don't anticipate BYU is going to be a super big brand that's going to bring in a bunch of high-powered recruits, but still fairly solid for this BYU program that still finds himself as one of the best teams in the Big 12 year after year. And the overall ranking comes out to number 25. And a little bit about that transfer portal ranking, I think, has to do with the fact that it's a smaller class, but that's because they didn't really need to go out and get too many people. And the people they did go out and get filled those needs pretty handily. There's maybe a couple things that I thought they'd maybe go after, but the big additions they bring in, Kyler Casper to help fill that wide receiver need. They still have guys on their team returning, but with Chase Roberts departing, who was focal to that passing attack, bringing in Casper is going to help Bear Bachmeier kind of still be a very productive quarterback. Also, with Walker Lyons coming in at tight end from USC, that's going to be a great weapon for them, especially considering they lost Carson Ryan, who was a focal point of that offense as well. They also shore up that offensive line a little bit with Zach Yamaguchi coming in from Stanford. And then probably the biggest addition they have to this team, bringing in Cal linebacker Cade Ulave, who was phenomenal with the Golden Bears, and I think is going to really help lead this defense, especially with the departure of Jack Kelly, who was one of their star linebackers from last season. So overall, talent-wise, I'm giving this a B plus. It's a lot of three stars and led primarily by Walker Lyons and Cade Olave in terms of talent as their four stars. But, you still find value in those three stars. And there's a reason that BYU went out and got them. Needs wise, I'm also giving it a B plus. I'm a little bit harsh here because I'm a little bit surprised that they didn't go out and get another safety with a departure of Tanner Wall. And really, the big one I was surprised at is they didn't go out and get too many defensive linemen, considering most of the defensive line is going to be gone. I will say, though, they had a bunch of young guys rotating in that I anticipate are going to end up being the starters anyway. But I'm still shocked that they didn't go out and get someone that maybe has a little bit more experience or is a little bit older. So that's why I have it as a B plus. And overall, that does come out to a grade of a B plus. But that does not mean I don't think this BYU team isn't going to be successful. This is purely off the fact that their transfer portal class maybe could have been a little bit better, but I still trust what they have available to them, and they didn't need to build their team through the transfer portal. They are building it through their returning players.
Now, looking at their schedule, it starts off with a really easy in-state game against Utah Tech. That will be a win. But then this home game against Arizona is not going to be easy. The Wildcats finished the season in the top 25, and we have them ranked even higher. I think they were pushing towards our top 15 in our way too early poll. And it's largely due to the fact that they're returning Noah Fafita at quarterback. He had a very good season last year, despite losing his number one target, Tateroa McMillan, to the NFL draft. And now this next season, I still think Arizona is going to be a really good team. They did a solid job in the transfer portal, so they will be able to compete. But with BYU having the home field advantage, I do think that they pull away in this game. Then it's a road trip to Colorado State. The Rams have been, I mean, decent in the Mountain West, but to be honest, the only thing that's giving them a 5% chance here is the fact that they're at home. Realistically, this will still be a win for BYU.
And then they have a pretty early bye week before the rest of their schedule plays out. And we'll see how that affects them because having that many games in a row in such a competitive conference like the Big 12 might be a detriment to them, but maybe with such a young roster, along with the experienced players they have at certain positions, it might end up paying off. And it starts with a road trip against TCU. And I'm interested to see how the Horned Frogs fare this season with the departure of Josh Hoover, who Trip Jonah and I have both really, really liked the past couple of years, and I think he's going to be a great fit at Indiana. But they bring in a starting quarterback from Harvard who has done very, very well in the Ivy League, but we'll have to see how that translates into the Big 12. And even with him arriving, they still have quite a bit that they need to replace from last season that led them to a pretty successful season, but nothing too highly acclaimed. But I still think TCU is going to be fairly good next season, and it is going to be a home game for them. So maybe this can be a little bit of an issue for the Cougars, but I do anticipate Bear Bachmeier will be comfortable in this situation and will be able to get a win on the road here. Then they face Iowa State, and the Cyclones, Jonah and I don't think are going to be very good next season with the departure of Matt Campbell and so many of those Iowa State players following him to Penn State. It's really just that. I don't anticipate them being as competitive they have been the last few years. I think BYU just returns so much more and is going to be the more talented team compared to the Cyclones here. And it's at home. Should be a win for them. And then probably the most anticipated game for them all season, hosting Notre Dame, the team that they were supposed to play in their bowl game until Notre Dame opted out. And I do think that BYU actually matches up decently well against the Fighting Irish. Granted, the Fighting Irish still have a loaded team. CJ Carr, I think, is more than worthy of being a Heisman frontrunner at this point in the offseason. I think despite the losses in the running back room, this wide receiver room has gotten very, very talented very quickly. And I think CJ Carr is going to have a very explosive season. The offensive line is still going to be great. And defensively, they might actually even be better than they were last season. But with the additions BYU's made and how competitive they have been in big games the last few years, I still could see them pulling off an upset at home here. So we are going to have it as a coin flip for right now. But I would anticipate Notre Dame to be slight favorites in this game just because the amount of talent on that roster is maybe just a little bit higher than that of BYU.
Next up is a road trip to UCF, and really the only intriguing thing for us about UCF is the fact that they brought in Alonzo Barnett from James Madison. Now, Barnett had a really good season last year for the Dukes, obviously leading them to the college football playoffs. Now, the level of competition in the Big 12 is a big step up from what James Madison was used to. And I do think that he's not going to have as good of a season, and especially just because I don't think UCF necessarily has the weapons to allow that as well. But he's a guy who can probably keep them in the game a little bit longer than people are expecting. I still just think that BYU in the end will have enough talent to overrun them on the road. Then it's Arizona State. Kenny Dillingham is always going to make this an interesting game. He's a really good head coach, and despite losing Sam Levitt, the way he has been able to develop quarterbacks, including Sam Levitt, suggests that he'll be able to continue that trend at Arizona State. He's a phenomenal head coach, and I do expect that even though Arizona State might not have had the best transfer portal class or the most returning production, losing some really important guys to this team, I still think that he's going to find a way to have a solid season there. And while it may not be good enough to win the Big 12 or to make the college football playoffs by any means, I do still think it'll be enough that they'll be able to compete with teams like BYU on the road. although ultimately BYU should be able to pull away here. And then it's the massive game against Utah. This one is going to be really difficult. The main thing going for BYU here is that Kyle Whittingham departed to be the head coach at Michigan, brought a few players with him, but Utah is still returning Devin Dampier at quarterback, and I still think they're going to be a really good team next season. Maybe not quite as good as this past season, but having to go on the road there, it's not going to be easy. Dampier is going to be hard to defend still with his dual threat ability. I think BYU is going to have some trouble, but I do expect them to have just a slight talent advantage. Even on the road, I think they'll be very, very minor favorites.
Last three games of the season, I don't think are going to be particularly difficult for BYU. Starts off with Baylor, a team that I thought was going to be very good last season with who they had returning, including starting quarterback Sawyer Robertson. And that did not pan out very well for me. And then this year, they've lost a lot of those players that I thought would have made them successful last year. Now, does that mean I think they're going to be good this year now that all those players are gone? Absolutely not. I think Baylor is going to see a good amount of regression again, and maybe they end up missing a bowl game. I just think BYU at home here is the clear-cut favorites, but we have seen Baylor still be competitive. It's the Big 12. Strange things have happened in the past, so we can't really put it too much higher, especially for a team like Baylor that has been somewhat consistent the last few years. But again, should be the favorites in this one. Then they're on the road against Kansas. No more Jalen Daniels for the Jayhawks, and I think that is going to be a big detriment to them, and they probably will return to what we typically thought of Kansas football, just not being super competitive. Again, who knows what could end up happening at this point in the season? We saw BYU collapse 2 years ago down the stretch, but I don't think this team is going to be capable of that. I think that they are hungry, and since they were so close to a college football playoff appearance last year, they will want it even more this year. And I think that that will be motivation enough to get them through some of these lesser opponents later in their season. And they cap it off with a game against Cincinnati at home. Now, this could have been an interesting game last season if it was the same Cincinnati roster, but Cincinnati no longer has Brendan Sorsby as he transferred to be the starting quarterback at Texas Tech. And without him, I do think Cincinnati lacks a lot of offensive firepower to compete with teams like BYU. So, once again, going to be a pretty substantial favorite in this one, 85% for us. So, overall, a pretty easy end to the year after maybe a little bit of a tougher start. We could easily see this BYU team making a push for the playoffs, getting back into that Big 12 championship game. It's going to be a great year for the Cougars once again.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things is that they don't have to play Texas Tech, which, like I mentioned earlier, is the reason that they ended up having two losses last season. But that does not change the fact that their projection is still to have three losses on the season. There's some difficult games on there, so it's definitely understandable. But I do think that they'll be able to exceed this projection from us. Getting more around a record of probably 11-1 seems most realistic for now. Just the amount of returning talent that they have, especially at the offensive skill positions. I think this offense is going to be scary. I fully expect BYU to have one of the best offenses in the Big 12, if not the country, next season. And I think that they are being incredibly disrespected by these national championship odds, plus 8,000, tied for number 20 in the country. Now, because they missed the playoffs last year, it's somewhat understandable to not have them, in the top 10 or something like that. But the fact that teams like Florida have better odds, according to Vegas, to win the national championship is pretty disrespectful. And I just think that's insane. BYU is going to have a really good team next year. And I think people need to stop overlooking them if their odds of plus 8,000 are actually realistic. So thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in our next video.